A renowned chef's pride blinds him to a boy's quiet dignity, until a shocking reveal forces him to rethink everything. What happens when the power of privilege confronts prejudice? Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more thought-provoking tales that challenge the way we see the world. The scent of aged Cabernet Sauvignon and seared scallops wafted through the air as Marcus Benson leaned against the kitchen counter, watching the dining room through the kitchen's open window. His restaurant, Opulent Plate, had a reputation for catering to the city's elite, a sanctuary for Manhattan's wealthy who craved perfection on their plates and exclusivity in their surroundings. Marcus took immense pride in upholding that standard. The son of a single mother who cleaned houses for the very kind of people he now served, Marcus had clawed his way up the culinary ladder to own one of the most sought-after restaurants in the city. "Chef, table 5 sent compliments to the kitchen," a waiter said, placing a folded napkin on the counter. Marcus nodded without looking, his eyes fixed on a young boy who had just stepped into the restaurant. The boy's presence immediately clashed with the carefully curated ambience. His sneakers were scuffed, his jeans frayed at the hems, and his oversized hoodie was stained and wrinkled. It was as if he had stumbled in from another world. "Who let him in?" Marcus asked, his tone low but clipped. The waitstaff followed his gaze, exchanging uncertain glances. The maitre d', a slender woman in a tailored black suit, approached the boy near the entrance. Marcus watched as she bent down slightly, her voice polite but clearly dismissive. The boy shook his head, gesturing toward the dining room. His words didn't carry to the kitchen, but Marcus saw the determination in his face. This wasn't the first time someone had wandered in without understanding the kind of establishment they'd entered. Marcus had seen plenty of tourists and passers-by turned away politely. His restaurant wasn't for everyone. But this kid didn't leave. Instead, he walked past the maitre d' and stood awkwardly near the edge of the dining area, his presence disrupting the seamless flow of servers and patrons. Marcus pushed off the counter, wiping his hands on a pristine white towel, and stepped into the dining room. His polished shoes clicked against the marble floor, the sound slicing through the soft hum of conversation and the gentle clink of fine silverware. "Excuse me," Marcus said, stopping a few feet from the boy. His voice carried an air of authority, honed from years of running a tight kitchen and an even tighter front-of-house operation. "Can I help you?" The boy looked up, his face pale but his eyes steady. "I just want something to eat." Marcus raised an eyebrow, taking in the boy's disheveled appearance. "This is a fine dining establishment. We have a dress code and reservations are required." "I don't have a reservation," the boy admitted. His voice was quiet but firm. "But I can pay." Marcus folded his arms, skepticism etched on his face. "You don't seem to understand. This isn't a diner or a fast food joint. We cater to a certain clientele." The boy's lips tightened, and for a moment Marcus thought he would leave. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. He opened it, revealing a few crumpled bills and a debit card. "I told you," the boy said, meeting Marcus's gaze, "I can pay." Marcus stared at the wallet, then back at the boy. The dining room had grown quieter, nearby patrons subtly watching the exchange with varying degrees of curiosity and discomfort. Marcus was acutely aware of their eyes on him, judging his next move. "Kid," Marcus began, his tone softening slightly, "this isn't about the money. It's about the experience we provide. You don't—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "You don't fit the atmosphere here." The boy's shoulders stiffened, and he clenched his fists at his sides. "I'm not asking for a freebie," he said, his voice rising. "I just want to eat." "That's enough," Marcus said firmly, his patience thinning. He gestured toward the entrance. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The boy didn't move. His defiance sent a ripple of unease through the room. A few diners whispered behind their hands, and a waiter hovering nearby shifted uncomfortably. Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. This isn't the place for you." The boy's jaw tightened, but after a long moment he nodded. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. For a brief second, Marcus felt a pang of regret, though he quickly dismissed it. He had a reputation to uphold. As the boy pushed open the heavy glass door, sunlight glinted off a ring on his hand, a ring engraved with a small crest. Marcus didn't notice, but a waiter near the bar froze, recognition flashing in his eyes. And just like that, the boy was gone, leaving an air of tension that lingered long after the door swung shut. Marcus returned to the kitchen, brushing off the encounter like crumbs from a cutting board. The boy's tattered clothes and stubbornness gnawed at him briefly, but he had long learned to suppress such distractions. He had a service to run, after all. Orders were flying in, and each plate demanded perfection. Yet, as Marcus plated a delicate piece of grilled halibut, he caught murmurs from the staff in the corner of the kitchen. "What's the deal with that kid?" one of the sous chefs whispered to a waiter. "I don't know," the waiter replied. "But did you see that ring he was wearing? It looked official, like a family crest or something." "Focus, people," Marcus barked, snapping them back to their tasks. He slid the halibut onto the service counter with a sharp clink. "We have diners who actually belong here waiting on their meals." Despite his commanding tone, Marcus couldn't shake the unease curling in his chest. The waiter's words echoed in his mind. A family crest. He dismissed the thought with a shake of his head. What did it matter? The kid had no business in his restaurant, crest or no crest. Out front, however, the boy hadn't left entirely. Standing near the large front window, he stared at the diners inside with a mix of longing and quiet resolve. He glanced at his wallet again, then at the pristine facade of opulent plate. The words "formal attire required" engraved on the brass plaque by the door glared back at him, daring him to challenge its implications. A passerby, an older man in a business suit, stopped beside him. "You all right, son?" he asked, looking concerned. The boy nodded quickly, shoving his wallet back into his pocket. "Yeah, I'm fine." The man hesitated for a moment before walking away. The boy took a deep breath, tightened his grip on the strap of his worn backpack, and re-entered the restaurant. The maitre d', who had been scanning the room with an eagle eye, immediately spotted him. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she approached him once again. "Young man," she said, her voice firm but controlled, "I thought we had already explained." "I need to speak to the chef," the boy interrupted, his voice louder than he intended. His words carried through the restaurant, drawing the attention of several nearby tables. The quiet clatter of forks and knives faltered, replaced by low murmurs. Marcus, hearing the commotion from the kitchen, pushed through the swinging doors, a fresh wave of irritation simmering in his chest. "What now?" he muttered under his breath as he approached the scene. The boy turned to face him, his expression a mix of defiance and desperation. "I told you I can pay," he said, louder this time. His voice wavered slightly, but he held his ground. "I just want a meal, that's all." Marcus folded his arms, his patience quickly wearing thin. "And I told you this isn't the place for you. There are plenty of other restaurants in the city." "Maybe," the boy shot back, "but I came here for a reason." "Oh," Marcus raised an eyebrow, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "And what reason is that?" The boy hesitated, glancing around at the growing number of patrons watching the exchange. He looked down at his feet, as though debating whether to reveal whatever truth he carried. "It's personal," he said finally, his voice softer now. "Personal," Marcus repeated, unimpressed. He sighed, glancing at the maitre d'. "Call security." "No," the boy blurted out, stepping closer. "Wait," his words faltered, and he suddenly seemed smaller, younger, in the vastness of the elegant dining room. "Son, listen," Marcus said, his voice lowering slightly. "I get that you're hungry, but this isn't about just paying for the food. This place is about an experience, about presentation, about belonging." He gestured vaguely at the room. "And you don't belong here. That's not a bad thing. It just is." The boy's face flushed. "I thought this was a place where anyone with the money could eat. Isn't that the whole point of a restaurant?" "It's more complicated than that," Marcus replied, though he wasn't sure he believed his own words. The boy's gaze, filled with equal parts anger and sadness, stirred something uncomfortable inside him. As Marcus prepared to step away and put the ordeal behind him, the boy took a step forward. "You don't know anything about me," he said, his voice trembling but determined. "You just looked at me and decided I didn't belong. Isn't that right?" Marcus froze, the words striking a nerve he hadn't anticipated. Before he could respond, the maitre d' placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder, guiding him toward the exit. Let's not make this any harder than it has to be, she said firmly. The boy allowed himself to be led toward the door, his head bowed and his fists clenched tightly at his sides. Just as he reached the entrance, he turned back to Marcus, his voice cracking with emotion. "You're wrong, you know." Marcus didn't respond. He couldn't. He stood rooted to the spot as the boy stepped outside, the heavy glass door swinging shut behind him. The room was quiet now, the weight of the exchange lingering in the air. Marcus felt the judgmental stares of his patrons, their silence more cutting than any words. He turned back toward the kitchen, his steps heavy, but not before catching sight of the maitre d', who looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher, pity, perhaps, or disappointment. Behind the bar, the same waiter who had noticed the crest on the boy's ring leaned against the counter, his brow furrowed in thought. Something about the boy's presence didn't sit right with him. Quietly, he excused himself and stepped outside, curiosity leading him toward the mysterious teenager. Marcus returned to the kitchen, determined to refocus on the night's service. Yet, no matter how meticulously he adjusted the microgreens on a plate or barked orders at the sous chefs, the boy's words gnawed at him. "You just looked at me and decided I didn't belong." Those words echoed in his mind, poking at a part of himself he usually kept buried. He was no stranger to being judged by appearances. Growing up, he'd felt those stares, teachers doubting his intelligence, patrons looking surprised when he emerged from the kitchen to greet them, and investors who hesitated to back his restaurant until they tasted his food. That boy's gaze, so resolute despite his tattered clothes, had stirred a guilt Marcus couldn't shake. Meanwhile, out on the sidewalk, the boy sat on a cold metal bench a few feet from the restaurant's entrance. His backpack rested beside him, and his shoulders slumped in defeat. He ran his thumb over the ring on his finger, its polished crest catching the glow of the streetlights. The engraved design was intricate, unmistakable to anyone who recognized it, the Trump family crest, complete with its regal lions and banner. Inside the restaurant, the waiter who had noticed the crest earlier couldn't let it go. "That kid's ring," he whispered to another server as they cleared a nearby table. It had a Trump crest on it. The server raised an eyebrow. "Like, that Trump?" "Yeah, I'm telling you." It looked legit. The waiter hesitated, glancing toward the kitchen doors. "I'm going out there." "What? Why?" "I just need to know," the waiter said, grabbing his coat and heading outside before his colleague could protest. He approached the boy cautiously, his breath visible in the chilly night air. "Hey kid," he said softly, trying not to startle him. "Mind if I sit?" The boy looked up, surprised, then nodded. The waiter sat down, studying the boy for a moment before gesturing to the ring. "That's an interesting piece you've got there." The boy's fingers instinctively covered the ring, his eyes narrowing. "Why do you care?" "No reason," the waiter said quickly, holding up his hands. "It's just, I've seen that crest before." The boy's shoulders tensed, but he didn't speak. The waiter pressed on, his voice gentle. "Look, I don't mean to pry, but are you part of that family? The Trumps?" For a long moment, the boy didn't answer. Then, with a reluctant sigh, he nodded. "Yeah," he admitted, "but it's not what you think." The waiter blinked, taken aback. "What do you mean?" The boy hesitated, his gaze dropping to the pavement. "I'm not close to them. My mom was a distant cousin. She passed a few years ago, and I've been on my own since." He swallowed hard, his voice trembling slightly. "I didn't come here to cause trouble. I wanted to see if people treated me differently without the name." The waiter sat back, stunned. "So, you're testing people?" "Kind of," the boy admitted. "I wanted to know if I could get by on my own without anyone knowing who I am, without all the privilege." The waiter nodded slowly, his mind racing. He'd seen Marcus turn people away before, tourists who didn't fit the dress code, couples who stumbled in hoping for a last-minute table. But this was different. This boy wasn't just any teenager, he was tied to one of the most recognizable families in America. "You should come back inside," the waiter said finally. "Let me talk to the chef." The boy shook his head. "Forget it. He made it clear I don't belong." "No, he doesn't know the whole story," the waiter insisted. "Let me." The sound of an approaching car cut him off. Both he and the boy turned as a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb. The back door opened, and a man in a tailored suit stepped out, his eyes scanning the street until they landed on the boy. His face softened with recognition. "There you are," the man said, striding over. "I've been looking all over for you." The boy stiffened, clearly not pleased to see him. "What are you doing here, Robert?" The man sighed. "You left without telling anyone. I had to make sure you were all right." He glanced at the restaurant, his brow furrowing. "Have you eaten?" "No," the boy muttered. "Not that it matters." Robert's expression darkened as he took in the boy's defeated posture. "Come on," he said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "We're going back in." Before the boy could protest, Robert marched him toward the entrance, the waiter trailing behind in disbelief. When they stepped inside, the restaurant went silent. Marcus, emerging from the kitchen to investigate the commotion, froze at the sight of the suited man and the boy. "Is there a problem?" Marcus asked, his voice cautious. Robert's eyes locked onto Marcus, and his voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone used to getting what they wanted. "Yes, there is. You refused to serve this young man." Marcus frowned. "Aye. Do you have any idea who he is?" Robert demanded, his tone icy. "He's a trump." A murmur swept through the dining room as the weight of the revelation settled over the patrons. Marcus's heart sank as the boy stepped forward, his gaze meeting Marcus's with a mixture of defiance and disappointment. "Still think I don't belong?" the boy asked quietly. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time in years, he found himself at a complete loss. The weight of Robert's words hung in the air, a ripple of shocked murmurs spreading across the dining room. Patrons leaned toward each other, their whispers just loud enough to sting Marcus's ears. He stood frozen, his mind racing as he pieced together the implications of what had just been revealed. The boy, this scruffy teenager who Marcus had dismissed outright, was a member of the Trump family. Marcus could feel the judgment in the room shift, no longer just directed at the boy's disheveled appearance, but now at Marcus himself. Robert stepped forward, his tailored suit cutting a sharp figure against the warm light of the restaurant. "I came here to resolve this quietly," he said, his voice low but cutting. "But it seems you've made that impossible." Marcus's jaw tightened, his usual confidence faltering under the intense scrutiny. "Look," he began, his tone carefully measured. "This isn't about who he is. We have a dress code and policies in place to maintain." "To maintain what?" Robert interrupted, his gaze piercing. "Your sense of superiority, your ability to judge people at a glance." "That's not what this is," Marcus replied, though even as he said it, he doubted his own words. He glanced at the boy, who stood silently beside Robert, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I had no idea who he was." "And that's the problem," Robert said sharply. "You didn't bother to find out. You just assumed." He gestured around the dining room, where the wealthy patrons sat in tense silence. "You think this place defines you? That exclusivity makes you better? Let me tell you something, your reputation is only as good as the respect you show others." The sting of Robert's words struck deep, but Marcus refused to let his emotions show. If he had explained himself. "He shouldn't have to explain himself," Robert snapped. "No one should. Not to you, not to anyone." The boy finally looked up, his voice soft but steady. "I didn't come here to cause trouble. I just wanted to see if someone would treat me like a person, not a name. Guess I got my answer." Marcus's chest tightened at the boy's words, guilt clawing at him. He had spent his entire career fighting against the biases others had imposed on him, yet here he was, guilty of the very same behavior. A tense silence followed, broken only when Robert turned to the boy. "Come on," he said, his tone gentler now. "We don't need to stay here." But before they could leave, one of the patrons, a regular who often dined alone, stood and cleared his throat. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice hesitant. "If I may. Chef Benson, you've always made this place feel like home for many of us. But tonight you've reminded me why I feel so out of place anywhere else." The words hit Marcus like a blow, but the man wasn't finished. That young man had the courage to walk in here, knowing he'd be judged. Maybe we could all learn something from that. Another patron chimed in. I agree, she said, setting down her glass of wine. It's easy to talk about equality and fairness when it's abstract, but when it's in front of us, that's when it counts. The room buzzed with murmurs of agreement, and Marcus felt the full weight of their collective gaze. His instinct was to defend himself, to explain that he hadn't meant any harm, but he knew words would ring hollow now. Instead, he took a deep breath and stepped forward, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "You're right," he said, addressing Robert and the boy. "I was wrong. I let my assumptions get the better of me, and for that, I'm sorry." Robert's expression softened slightly, though his posture remained rigid. The boy, however, studied Marcus with an unreadable expression. "It's not about me," the boy said after a moment. "It's about what you'll do next time." The words carried more weight than Marcus expected, and he nodded slowly. "I understand," he said quietly. "Let me make it right." Robert tilted his head, skeptical. "And how do you plan to do that?" Marcus turned to the boy. "Please stay. Let me serve you the way I should have from the start." The boy hesitated, glancing at Robert, who gave a slight nod. Finally, the boy stepped forward, his movements tentative. "Okay," he said, "but not because I'm a trump. Because I'm hungry." A ripple of laughter broke the tension in the room, and Marcus allowed himself a small, relieved smile. "Fair enough," he said. He gestured to the maitre d', who quickly led the boy and Robert to a table. As Marcus returned to the kitchen, the staff watched him with a mix of curiosity and approval. He took a deep breath and barked, "Fire up a special for table 7. Make it perfect." The night carried on, but the incident lingered in Marcus's mind. He had always prided himself on his ability to run a flawless restaurant, but tonight he realized perfection wasn't about the food or the ambience. It was about the people. When the meal was over and the boy left, he paused at the door, turning back to Marcus. "Thanks," he said simply. Marcus nodded, watching as the boy disappeared into the night. It wasn't just thanks for the meal, it was thanks for the lesson Marcus hadn't realized he needed. The restaurant was quiet now, the evening rush fading into the soft clinks of silverware and hushed conversation. Marcus stood by the pass, watching his staff clean up the last remnants of the night. The boy's table had been cleared and he was long gone, but his words echoed in Marcus's mind. "It's about what you'll do next time." Marcus wiped his hands on a towel, then folded it neatly on the counter. He turned to his sous chef. "Run the closing checklist for me, Carla. I need to step out." Carla nodded, her brows knitting together briefly in concern. Marcus rarely left the kitchen before the lights were dimmed and the doors locked. Tonight was different. He walked out through the main dining room, his polished shoes soft against the marble floor. A few remaining diners glanced up as he passed, their expressions a mix of respect and curiosity. Outside, the crisp evening air bit at his skin. He shoved his hands into his pockets, his steps slow and deliberate as he approached the bench where the boy had sat earlier. Though empty now, the bench seemed to carry a weight, a memory that lingered in the air. Marcus sat down, staring out at the busy street, the sounds of honking horns and distant laughter filling the silence. He pulled out his phone and stared at the black screen. For a long moment, he considered dialing his mother, a woman who had always taught him to hold his head high despite the world's judgments. She would know what to say, but he didn't press the call button. This was something he needed to figure out on his own. "Chef." Marcus turned to see the waiter from earlier standing a few feet away, his jacket draped over one arm. "You all right?" the waiter asked, his voice tentative. Marcus nodded, though his eyes betrayed his unease. "Yeah, just thinking." The waiter sat beside him, his posture as hesitant as his tone. "About the kid?" "Yeah," Marcus sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I've spent years trying to prove that I belong in spaces like this, that I earn my place. But tonight, I acted like the people who've judged me my whole life. I didn't even realize I was doing it." The waiter nodded, his gaze fixed on the ground. "We all have blind spots, chef. The important thing is you saw it. Most people don't." "That's not enough," Marcus said firmly. "Seeing it doesn't change what I did. It doesn't change how he felt walking in here." "Maybe not," the waiter agreed. "But what you do next, that can change a lot." Marcus sat in silence for a moment, the boy's words replaying in his head like a broken record. He stood abruptly, his decision clear. "Thanks, Kyle," he said, clapping the waiter on the shoulder. "Go home. I've got some work to do." Kyle nodded, his lips curving into a small smile as he walked away. Marcus returned to the restaurant, the energy in his steps purposeful. The staff was nearly done with their tasks, the kitchen sparkling clean as usual. Carla looked up as he entered, a curious tilt to her head. "Everything all right, chef?" she asked. Marcus nodded. "Yeah, but I need to make some changes around here." He gestured for her to gather the remaining staff. When they were all assembled, he took a deep breath. "Listen, I want to talk about what happened tonight," he began. His voice carried a weight that silenced the room. "I made a mistake. I let my assumptions about that boy cloud my judgment, and it wasn't right. That's not the kind of restaurant I want to run." The staff exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from surprise to quiet approval. Marcus continued, his tone firm but reflective. "Starting tomorrow, we're reevaluating our policies. I don't want anyone walking in here and feeling like they don't belong just because of how they look or what they're wearing. We'll still have standards, but they'll be about respect and behavior, not appearances." Carla nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Sounds like a good step." Marcus exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "It's overdue?" After the staff dispersed, Marcus returned to his office. He sat at his desk staring at the glowing screen of his laptop. He opened the restaurant's website, scrolling to the section labeled policies. His eyes lingered on the words "formal attire required," the phrase that had fueled his earlier decision. With a decisive click, he highlighted the line and pressed delete. He replaced it with a new statement. "All are welcome at Opulent Plate. We believe in exceptional food, respect, and inclusivity." The words felt right. They felt true. The next day, Marcus arrived earlier than he had in years. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the city in hues of gold and pink. He unlocked the door to the restaurant, the quiet stillness greeting him like an old friend. Taking the formal attire required plaque from its place by the entrance, he studied it for a moment before setting it aside. As the day unfolded, Marcus moved with renewed energy. He greeted his staff warmly, consulted with his suppliers, and even spent time perfecting a new dish he'd been experimenting with. By evening, the dining room buzzed with life, and Marcus found himself at ease for the first time in weeks. Toward the end of the night, a note was delivered to the kitchen. Marcus opened it, recognizing the neat handwriting immediately. "Thank you for listening. It's not about being perfect, it's about being better. R." A small smile broke across Marcus's face. He folded the note carefully and tucked it into his pocket. It wasn't just a reminder of the night's events, it was a promise to himself. He had learned a lesson that evening, one he wouldn't forget. And as the restaurant's doors swung open for a new wave of diners, Marcus knew he had taken the first step toward being the person he always wanted to be. The next evening, Opulent Plate hummed with its usual energy. Patrons filled the elegant dining room, their laughter and conversation mingling with the soft notes of piano music drifting from the speakers. Marcus stood in the kitchen, overseeing every dish that went out, but something was different. He wasn't just watching for perfection in the presentation, he was observing how his staff worked, how they treated one another, and how they spoke to their guests. "Chef, Table 8 sent compliments," Carla said, handing him a note scribbled on the back of a menu. "They loved the duck confit." "Good," Marcus replied, glancing at the note before tucking it into his apron. "Let's keep it up." Carla lingered for a moment, her expression contemplative. "You seem different today, chef. Lighter." Marcus smirked. "Let's just say I've been reminded why I started this place in the first place. Now, back to work." Carla chuckled and headed back to her station. Marcus exhaled, looking out through the kitchen window at the dining room. It was bustling as always, but tonight it felt warmer. The changes he'd initiated were subtle but noticeable. The staff seemed more relaxed, their interactions with guests more genuine. The rigid air of exclusivity that had defined the restaurant was beginning to dissolve, replaced by something more human. Outside, a young couple stood hesitantly by the entrance. The man adjusted his tie nervously, while the woman smoothed her floral dress. "Are you sure this is the place?" she asked, her voice laced with uncertainty. "This is it," the man replied, double-checking the address on his phone. "But I don't know if we're, dressed for it." The woman bit her lip, glancing through the glass doors at the elegant diners inside. Just as they began to turn away, the maitre d' opened the door with a warm smile. "Good evening," she said. "Do you have a reservation?" The couple exchanged nervous glances before the man cleared his throat. No, we didn't know if we'd be allowed in." The maitre d' smiled, stepping aside. "You're more than welcome. Please come in." Relieved, the couple entered, their awe visible as they took in the sophisticated atmosphere. The maitre d' led them to a table near the window, where they sat down with grateful smiles. Marcus, watching from the kitchen, felt a sense of satisfaction he hadn't felt in years. Later that evening, as the last few tables lingered over dessert, Marcus took a rare moment to step out of the kitchen. He walked through the dining room, stopping occasionally to chat with patrons. Many expressed their appreciation for the changes they'd noticed, small touches that made the experience feel more inclusive and welcoming. As he approached the couple who had hesitated at the door, Marcus noticed their plates were empty and their faces were glowing with gratitude. The man looked up, his eyes lighting up when he recognized Marcus. "Chef Benson," he said, standing to shake his hand. "This was incredible. Thank you." Marcus smiled, shaking his hand firmly. "I'm glad you enjoyed it. You're always welcome here." The woman nodded, her voice soft but sincere. "We've never been anywhere like this. It felt special." "It's supposed to," Marcus replied. "Food isn't just about what's on the plate, it's about how it makes you feel. Thank you for letting us be part of your evening." The couple beamed, and Marcus excused himself to continue his rounds. By the time he returned to the kitchen, the dining room was nearly empty. The staff had begun the closing routine, the sound of clattering dishes and running water filling the space. As the last light was dimmed, Marcus stood at the entrance, locking the doors behind the final departing guests. He paused, taking in the quiet street outside. The weight of the past few days lingered, but it felt lighter now. Change was never easy, but it was necessary. Reaching into his pocket, Marcus pulled out the folded note from the boy. He read it again under the soft glow of the streetlights. "It's not about being perfect, it's about being better." Marcus smiled faintly and slipped the note back into his pocket. The boy's words weren't just a reminder of what had happened, they were a call to action. Marcus knew the work wasn't done. There would be more challenges, more moments where his instincts might falter. But now he was committed to being better, not just as a chef, but as a person. The next morning, Marcus arrived early, the restaurant still cloaked in the quiet calm before the city's rush. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, flipping on the lights. On the wall by the entrance, where the formal attire required plaque had once hung, a new sign greeted him. It was simple, elegant, and spoke to the heart of what opulent plate had become. "All are welcome." Marcus ran his fingers over the smooth surface of the sign, a small smile playing on his lips. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he belonged. And as the city outside began to stir, Marcus knew one thing for certain: he had found not just a new way forward, but a way to truly honor the journey that had brought him here.